Welcome back to our continuing series on becoming an evidence-based analyst. In this installment, we will be reviewing the second step in evidence-based analysis. Develop a model that can warrant a claim by predicting the root causes of a problem or opportunity. Each slide in this presentation will provide information on a key concept of evidence-based analysis, or EBA for short. We will begin with a quick review of the steps of EBA. Then you will learn how definitive claims and designative claims should be visualized. We will review an example of a comprehensive warrant model. As discussed in previous EBA tutorials, warrant models explain why a claim should be true. The warrant model is referred to as a path model because it depicts the paths from root cause to outcome. Next, you will learn the parts of each section of a path model diagram. We will review the procedure for interpreting the path model. Finally, you will learn the procedure for analyzing a designative claim by calculating and critically thinking about the predicted effects in the model. At the end of this tutorial, you should be ready to begin practicing claim analysis. Please post any questions or comments on EBA concepts and techniques in the discussion forum. You should practice application of the procedures discussed in this tutorial by submitting a draft EBA analysis of factors that you find interesting or valuable. The best presentations are those developed through several drafts. Each draft should incorporate revisions based on the feedback on previous drafts that you receive from me and your peers. Frequent practice in applying the EBA techniques will prepare you to develop effective presentations for your employers or clients. Your EBA analyses will offer valuable and deep insights and demonstrate your distinctive expertise. As discussed in the previous tutorials, there are 4 steps required to perform EBA. These steps allow us to develop or evaluate a recommendation. We begin an evidence-based analysis by asking an answerable question. In the second step, we seek to find a model of the factors that may be causing the outcomes the question seeks to understand or influence. If we fail to find a model, we will need to develop one from backing studies that provide detailed examples of factors that are associated with the targeted outcomes in organizational settings. However derived, the model then provides a basis for a designative claim statement. Next, evidence is gathered. We evaluate the evidence to determine if it grounds the model's predictions in hard evidence. Finally, we assess the risk of an evidence-based recommendation. Thus, the last step in EBA is to calculate prediction and measurement risk associated with the designative and definitive claims, respectively. The previous 2 tutorials reviewed how to develop an answerable question. This tutorial will cover the next step in evidence-based analysis: how to develop a model of the factors that warrants the claim statement. A warrant seeks to guarantee that the claim is true by backing it with a causal explanation and predictions for the impact that each causal factor should have on an outcome. For this tutorial, we will be seeking to answer the question, how does interdependence and conflict among teammates affect commitment to the team and the organization? This question seeks to understand how to impact 2 outcome factors: team commitment and organizational commitment. If we have no idea what are the causes of commitment in organizations, we would begin by searching for scholarly articles that could suggest causes. We could collect a few models that showed substantive impact of 1 or more causes of commitment. Then we could compare the models to find the factors that seem to consistently show substantive effects on either team commitment, organizational commitment, or both. However, in this case, we suggested that the interdependence among team members required to collaborate on team tasks and the conflict that may arise among the team members can impact commitment. This belief may be informed by a claim that we read somewhere. We may also believe these causal factors are influential because of our own or others' experience. But we should remember that no matter what the source or amount of backing a claim receives, simply because we believe a factor is a substantive cause of an outcome does not guarantee that the evidence will support that belief. Consequently, we should begin our evidence-based analysis by searching for a model that could warrant further investigation by estimating the effects of task interdependence and conflict on organizational and team commitment. The easiest models to begin with are those that literally draw the connections for us. A model diagram that connects causes to outcomes is called a path model. Path models are statistically calculated using a technique called structural equation modeling. Therefore, we can use the terms path model or structural equation model when searching Google Scholar for warrant model support development of a claim. In Google Scholar, you could enter phrases within quotation marks that you want to appear exactly as specified in the article. By placing structural equation in quotes, we can avoid finding papers that might refer to other types of structure, such as organization structure, in an article that somewhere else references equations. Any phrase that uses words which might commonly appear in text that would be unrelated to our question should be placed in quotation marks. For example, organizational commitment or perceived task interdependence. At this stage, we are interested in two different types of models. First, we can search for specifically structural equation models. Secondly, we can search for any kind of path model. In future tutorials, we will discuss other search terms that will help you find each of the 8 different types of backing and grounding studies that provide evidence versus a theory or opinion statement. The article by Sue et al. 2009 that is entitled Methods for Developing Actionable Evidence for Consumers of Health Services Research can be found in the Files section and provides an overview of each of these article types. A very helpful feature of Google Scholar is that we'll automatically sort the results in the order in which they are likely to be relevant for your search. This allows us to compare the results of 2 different model types to see if any papers consistently come out on top. As you can see here, the 2 searches produced nearly the same number of hits. However, the more generic path model search found 8 papers that were not found using the more restrictive structural equation search term. In your searches, you can decide which method is best for the type of models you seek to find. Since both searches produced the same article by Bishop and Scott 2000 at the top of the list, we can be somewhat confident that this is a good starting point for developing a claim. Their model suggests the following claim in answer to our question. Team and organizational commitment is increased by perceived task interdependence, but resource and communication conflict can reduce commitment both directly and by influencing satisfaction with supervisors and peers. We will now walk through how to analyze the key diagrams and tables in this paper to develop an evidence-based model that warrants further investigation of the causes of organizational and team commitment. Let's first take a look at the definitive claims in the Bishop and Scott article. The model produced by Bishop and Scott, as shown on the left, is an excellent example of a comprehensive warrant model. All the indicators used in defining each factor are shown in boxes. The arrows point from the factor to each indicator that defines it. The indicators are survey questions or statements. They provide a measure of an attribute, characteristic, or other feature that distinguishes the factor from other factors. Unfortunately, not all study authors are as careful in specifying their definitive claims as Bishop and Scott. You may not see boxes for indicators in other studies. Sometimes they will use circles instead. Circles or ovals should really only be used for factors. Nevertheless, reviewing the excellent Bishop and Scott example should prepare you to interpret models that you find in the papers that you analyze. If you have any questions on a model diagram, please post a snipped image or a link to the paper in the discussion forum. This way, not only can you receive further instructions on how to interpret the model diagram, but others in the discussion forum can also learn how to understand less well-constructed models than the one shown here. The arrow lines from the factors to the indicators are showing us that the factor is causing the respondent to answer the survey in a specific way. For example, the feeling of inter-sender conflict causes the person to respond to questions X9 to X14 in a particular way. The more reliable each indicator is in gauging respondents' feelings of inter-sender conflict, the higher that item's coefficient will be. Item reliability coefficients, like a correlation, range from 0 to 1. This coefficient tells us how much weight should be placed on this indicator item. how much load it should carry in measuring the factor. The loading weights for each survey item are listed in a factor loading table. The factor loading table provides a reliability estimate for every indicator item shown in the model diagram. A factor loading of greater than or equal to 0.7 indicates that the item is a good measure. The reliability of an entire set of items in a survey or other measurement instrument is determined by Cronbach's alpha. We will be discussing how to interpret Cronbach's alpha and to evaluate definitive claim warrants, also called measurement models, in a future tutorial. In the Bishop and Scott paper, the factor loading table, Table 1, can be found on page 444. You may want to pause the replay of this tutorial here to review this table. Ask yourself which indicator item would be best to use for each factor. Which indicator items should be removed because they are not reliable measures. I will pause shortly to allow you time to pause this video before we advance to the next slide. We will now turn our focus to the designative claim for the remainder of the tutorial. You can now ignore the boxes and their arrow lines in the diagram. The designative claim is shown by the factor labels listed in the ovals and the arrows that connect the causal paths to the two outcome factors. You can always determine the outcomes in a model by locating the ovals which only have arrows coming into them from other factors, and none going out. By following the arrow lines, you can determine if a causal factor has a direct or an indirect effect on an outcome. For direct effects, a line with no arrow will come out of the causal factor. It will end with an arrow in the factor that it affects. For indirect effects, there will be multiple arrow lines from the causal factor to the outcome factor. The causal factors shown furthest to the left in the diagram are the root causes of the model. The causal factors in the middle of the diagram are called mediating factors because some of the total effect of the root cause is due to the mediating factor influence on the outcome. For example, inter-sender conflict in the diagram has both a direct and indirect effect on team commitment. The indirect mediating effect on team commitment is through satisfaction with coworkers. Additionally, inter-sender conflict has an indirect mediating effect through satisfaction with supervision on organizational commitment. The effect size of a factor is estimated by a correlation. But this simply indicates how much the two factors co-vary, or how much they are associated with each other. In evidence-based analysis, we are interested in knowing how much each factor causes or impacts the outcome. In other words, how much of a change in the outcome is explained by the causal factor. The impact of a causal factor can be found by squaring these correlations. We must multiply the correlation by itself to determine impact. By examining all the arrow lines, we can now summarize the warrant model. Bishop and Scott are proposing that perceived task interdependence directly affects organizational and team commitment. Perceived task interdependence is defined using one scale of 4 indicators. The authors of this model are proposing 2 types of conflict that impact commitment: resource-related and inter-sender communications. Resource-related conflict is expected to directly impact organizational commitment. This type of conflict also is expected to indirectly impact organizational commitment by altering satisfaction with supervision. Resource-related conflict is measured by a scale with 4 indicators. As previously mentioned, inter-sender conflict is expected to have a direct effect on team commitment and indirect effects on both forms of commitment. Notice especially how the definitive claim for inter-sender conflict shows 2 separate scales, each with 3 indicators. This is called a multidimensional factor. Factors that are defined with only one scale are called unidimensional factors. The outcomes are both multidimensional factors. Now let's examine the designative claims to determine if any of the proposed factors are expected to have a substantive impact on one or more outcomes. The path estimates for each factor effect are shown in the diagram on the left. We can use this single study to determine which of these effects to include in a final model. We will test this model using the results of evidence provided by other studies. As we discussed in a previous tutorial, Scandura points out that you cannot rely on a single study when making a recommendation or a decision. The first study can provide the warrant model, but we need to find additional evidence that tests these predictions. The sign of the correlation, or past estimate, indicates the direction of the effect. A positive correlation means that both the cause and the outcome move in the same direction. When the cause goes up, the outcome goes up. And when the cause decreases, the outcome decreases. Negative correlations indicate an inverse direction. When a cause increases, the outcome decreases, and vice versa. For example, as inter-sender conflict increases, the satisfaction with supervisors and coworkers will decrease, as will team commitment. As satisfaction with coworkers decreases, team commitment will also decrease. You may recall from a statistics class that correlations also have p-values, which indicate whether the result was significant. The number of asterisks listed next to a correlation on the diagram indicates how significant was that finding. However, significant in this case does not mean what you might think. Significant does not mean the effect is important or even sizable. Statistical significance means what is the likelihood that the effect was simply due to randomness. In other words, the more asterisks, the greater the odds that the causal factor did have a systematic effect on the outcome. However, that factor may still be quite small, insubstantial. In evidence-based analysis, we are mainly interested in impact, not chance. As previously mentioned, impact is determined by squaring the correlation. A squared correlation is an estimate of how substantive that effect will be. As a rule of thumb, we separate the impact into three types. First, effects with correlations between 0.3 and 0.49 are labeled small effects because they explain less than a quarter of the change in the outcome. Correlations between 0.5 and 0.7 are labeled medium effects because they explain between 1/4 and 1/2 of the change in the outcome. Finally, correlations greater than 0.7 are labeled large effects because the majority of the change in the outcome is explained by the causal factor having these high correlations. Any effect below a correlation of 0.3 we consider to be insubstantial because it explains less than 10% of the change in an outcome. These insubstantial effects question whether consideration of a factor is worthwhile. An insubstantial effect calls into question the prediction of a model. The small size of the effect questions whether that causal factor should be considered further. Consequently, we call these reservations. The small size of these effects should cause us to reserve judgment on including an insubstantial causal factor in our plans to influence the outcome. As mentioned previously, this model includes both direct and indirect effect paths. Whenever a causal factor has direct and indirect paths, we need to combine their effects to calculate the total effect of a causal factor on an outcome. The rules for calculating the paths are called Wright's path tracing rules, after the first person to document how to combine the path coefficients. Wright's rules determine how we add together the path effects. First, write down the direct path coefficient. Second, below the direct effect, we list each indirect path separately. When models are more complex, we need to make sure that we do not reverse directions along the path on our way from root cause to the outcome. For each indirect path, we must multiply all the coefficients along the indirect path. Finally, we sum the column listing the direct and indirect path effects to determine the total effect of a causal factor on the outcome. Once all the paths from all factors to all outcomes have been calculated, you can determine which causal factors have a substantive effect on one or more outcomes. Any substantive factors should be kept, and any insubstantial factors should be removed from the model. We can note which factors were removed because they were insubstantial. Or we can use dotted lines to show that a factor relationship was not estimated to be substantial in the warrant model. Let's now apply Wright's rules to develop a warrant model that would support a claim about the causal factors influencing team and organizational commitment, that we could test using evidence-based analysis. The table on the right provides the calculations necessary to determine the path effects for each of the three root causes of organizational conflict: resource-related conflict, perceived task interdependence, and inter-sender conflict. Notice in the calculation of indirect effects that we work backwards from the outcome to the root cause. This ensures that we do not miss any line from an outcome back to the root cause. The calculations show that the total effects of the root causes on organizational commitment are negative 0.34 for resource-related conflict, negative 0.15 for inter-sender conflict, and 0.16 for perceived task interdependence. We calculate the total effects on team commitment using the same approach. These calculations show that the total effects of the root causes of team commitment are negative 0.064 for inter-sender conflict and 0.11 for perceived task interdependence. With total effects on all outcomes calculated, we are now ready to simplify the model in preparation for examining evidence that may support a revised claim or provide further reservations. In an EBA model, we eliminate all the factors that only had insubstantial effects. We also only show estimated effect sizes for substantive effects. A causal factor that had substantive effects on one outcome, but insubstantial effects on another, provides a reservation for the model. We show this reservation by using a dotted line connecting inter-sender conflict and organizational commitment. The correlation estimate is removed from the reservation line to show that this estimate needs to be determined from further analysis. Mediating factors are only shown if they had a substantive total effect by themselves. The result of this analysis is provided in the diagram on the left. This diagram makes it clear that resource-related conflict is important for influencing organizational commitment, while inter-sender conflict is important for influencing team commitment. Both of these effects are negative, which means that to improve either type of commitment, we need to reduce conflict. We are now ready to prepare our conclusions. In EBA, it is generally a good idea to list the most substantive impact factors first. We list any reservations found in our analysis at the end of the conclusion. Inter-sender conflict is predicted to have a medium-large effect on team commitment. The increase in inter-sender conflict is expected to explain 41% of a decrease in team commitment. Resource-related conflict is predicted to have a small effect on organizational commitment. An increase in resource-related conflict will only explain about 11% of the decrease in organizational commitment. We found reservations to the original model that had been proposed. Perceived task interdependence was not found to be a substantive factor. Inter-sender conflict was found as a substantive factor of team commitment, but may not be a substantive factor in predicting organizational commitment. Now it's your turn. You should practice applying the claim analysis process that we have reviewed in this tutorial. First, identify one or more causal or outcome factors that you find personally interesting or which you believe will be important to your future career development. Ask an answerable question that involves the factors you want to study. Determine if a designative claim has been proposed regarding the factors. If so, you can then locate a model that explains and predicts how the causal factors should impact the desired outcomes, as we did in our example. If you don't have a designative claim for the factors, you can search Google Scholar for the outcome factors in the phrase structural equation, in quotes, model, or path model to locate a paper that can provide a warrant model from which you can develop a designative claim using the analysis techniques reviewed in this tutorial.